Hey everybody, it's the Epistemologers, and today's topic is the discernment, which is a word that, if you're not familiar with, comes from the sort of spiritual side of the internet, and it talks about intuition and using your intuition to sort of judge if something's true or not. If it agrees with your own intuition, then you have discerned that it is correct. And this kind of lines up with epistemology, I think, in that it's in that they're describing a similar process, but they're using their intuition as it happens to try to describe it, which often ends badly because intuitive things are hard to describe at first until you understand it, consciously.
Yeah, I hear discernment comes up a lot as a way to say you are kind of in charge of what you believe.
Yeah.
You can choose to believe this, you can choose to believe that, and you're kind of like a horse that others might want to bring you to water, but you can choose to drink or not.
Right.
It's just your power of discernment. They use it in spiritual circles.
But they talk about discernment
because of the free will aspect.
Well, they talk about discernment, the power you have to get better at discernment, and that's what I was describing. Is that there seems to be some process of getting better at discernment, but I'm not exactly sure. I don't think that's ever fully.
It's
described.
Not fully. Yeah, it's like they don't get into it. What exactly are you doing when you discern something, and is it possible that you can get better at it?
Yeah.
What's the process?
Yeah,
that's what we wanted to talk about.
And I guess they could say practice makes perfect. Keep on discerning things until you get better. But
just feel it out, man.
Yeah, just feel it out. But I don't.
Which is horrible advice, by the way.
Well, it's just not. It's not good. It's not good to say just feel it out because that's not helpful.
Kind of leaves you hanging.
Yeah.
Okay, but maybe your feelings aren't going to help you in this particular instance.
Yeah. What if you're just naturally bad at discernment? Yeah,
we're not all that intuitive. Yeah. Like some of us might not be at all. We just kind of have to rely on what what's going on around us. But we can get into it. Like we've talked about this constraint cycle before.
Yeah.
I kind of want to briefly run over that because it's going to come up in here.
Just go into it, man.
Yeah, so the constraint cycle is really just kind of our recommendation of how to judge ideas, to layer on different kinds of constraint onto an idea and judge it to be a good idea. And this directly gets into discernment.
Right. Which is the same sort of discernment when the spiritual community talks about it. They're talking about a way to tell what idea is better than the other, and that's we use a different thing, or we describe something that's not different, but it's another way of doing it.
We put it into words. We make it explicit. So they will typically just lean on the intuition side of it, but that's just where we start. So intuition is just you getting an impression from your background knowledge or from whatever you have going on around you, or just basically could be a huge degree or a huge set of information. And you're distilling that down to an impression, which is just where it starts. That's your probably most speculative point. That's this initial guess that you have. It could be a wild guess. If you're a very intuitive person, like near psychic, you might actually have a pretty good guess.
Yeah,
but it's still a pretty good guess. And you're not ever going to get to being certain at that stage, especially.
And even if you're not particularly intuitive, you could have a good guess just out of understanding what's going on well enough, or having a lucky guess, right? A moment in which you are intuiting correctly, or whatever.
Yeah. You just kind of happen to land on it.
It's a crapshoot, sort of thing.
It can happen.
Yeah.
But it's going to happen more reliably if you use an intuition.
Yeah.
So I see consciousness as basically a reduction of that field of information, like background knowledge and whatever else we have to work with, down to a single focused impression. So at that stage in the game, we're talking about just the very start of this thing we call the constraint cycle. And so you get this guess, and you're trying to pass it through this essentially series of challenges. The first section, the first challenge, is a philosophical / logical / explanatory challenge. So you're trying to say this idea really could be about anything, but if it's an explanation, you have a lot more to check, right?
Sure.
So explanations are great because they hold other ideas in place into a framework. They'll be about other things. They'll explain things. They'll connect certain dots, and all of that is stuff you can check logically. So you can run over the logic of the explanation with a fine-tooth comb, and you can find conflicts in the logic. And anytime you find a conflict, well, it didn't pass that challenge.
Right.
So basically, that idea just didn't make it down the gauntlet of challenges.
What do you think if it's hard to explain? If this is the explanatory challenge, if it's hard to explain, does it not pass
because of complexity?
Challenge? Yeah,
maybe.
Well, maybe because of complexity, maybe because you lack the proper words to explain it.
Or maybe even like lack of experience sometimes.
Yeah,
that happens a lot.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of reasons why you might not have an ability to explain something, but it's all a form of ignorance.
Sure.
It's always just because we haven't come up with an explanation for that thing yet.
Yes. Okay.
So things that are hard to explain, even really complex things, you can explain at a high level.
Yes.
And it makes it seem simple. And that's actually a trick that we do with explanations all the time in programming. Because programming, you're simulating all kinds of things, many, like multiple dimensions of many variables, many like processes happening all at once. And it can get very complex, but the programmer is seeking to do the same thing by making it simple, at least simple to comprehend.
Right.
So, and the key to that, again, is explanation, trying to simplify the explanation. So a lot of times the software that I build is the product of an explanation I sought to make simpler. So really at the base of it, we're trying to not create buggy software, and we're trying to get like something done that actually works. And in order to do that, you have to understand it. And that understanding is really only going to come from a good explanation. This is true in general, not just programming, but in life. So, and this is key to discernment. So this is why we hammer on good explanation all the time.
Yes.
Good explanation is really like right after your intuition. It's the second part to this whole discernment process.
And I would say there is, because I know this constraint cycle. Do you want to finish up the next two? The next one is a scientific, in which
yeah, sure,
I can finish that up. So the next one is scientific.
Yeah.
And that deals with you're creating a falsifiable experiment. So you're creating something where you're going to say, I'm going to try to prove this wrong and prove my idea, my explanation false in some way. So my explanation says it should be this way. Well, I'm going to test and see if that it actually is that way. And if it's not that way, then it has failed in the scientific realm, in the scientific part of the constraint cycle. Is that a pretty good summation?
Pretty good. I wouldn't use the term should just because I reserve that for ethics.
Sure.
Science. So should, by should you mean is. I think in this case.
Yeah.
You're trying to say it is this way
Yeah.
in reality, and science is just about going out there and messing around with reality.
I was trying to work with the expectation.
For informative purposes.
I was using should in the expectation way. Yeah, that I expect it to be this way.
Yeah, I think there's just some ambiguity with the term that...
It's fair.
Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify. So, yeah, science. Did you... and then, that I think is good. Yep. If you want to move on to the next one.
And then artistic... Well, I might need some help with the artistic.
You passed over...
Oh,
do engineering.
Engineering is about building. So you have satisfied the falsification. You have gotten it past the experimenting, testing it out, and now you're going to build it. You're going to fully come from concept into a actuality. So you're going to take the idea that you had, and you're going to build something with it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be tangible, and it doesn't necessarily have to be so it can be anything. And I think this can extend to, like, you can build a theory, or you can build a group, or you can build an idea, a set of ideas around this.
There's a lot you can build.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily that it has to be tangible.
Well, information's weird, but information has to always be embodied into something physical.
Right.
So we think of it as something else because it's abstract, but it is a tangible thing.
Yeah.
It just is. It happens to be just as specialized in coding into something physical.
Right.
So it's nothing. It's like the concept of virtuality. It doesn't. It's not helpful. Generally, like, even a game is real. There's a
you are
that's real.
You are going through the process of playing the game. So a game would be engineered in some way. And so
there's anytime you're trying to build something, put something into your life, you have to consider what should be there.
Yep.
Like, what kind of bridge should we build? What kind of world do we want to have? What kind of life do I want to lead? And this is all ethics, basically. Yeah. Engineering is taking science and applying ethics.
Yes. What should we do with what we know now? Yeah. What should we do with what we have certain has passed this point of scientific constraint. Yeah. Yeah.
So the main question here, where science is, we're trying to get information about whether we were right or wrong.
Yes.
So we'll have a guess. It makes predictions. We can test those predictions experientially, and then for informative purposes, it can show us that we're wrong. Basically, that's what science is for. When we're talking about engineering, we add on to that. We want it to pass the science, but if it does pass the science, we then want to consider, does it help us to actually build something? So we're able to produce an experiential result that is the actual bridge or the whatever we're trying to build. And we can then judge that. That's an extra layer of judgment we can apply, an extra layer of constraint. So were we able to build what we set out to build? Yes, no? Well, that's the challenge. Yep. So the next stage is the art stage. And this is a subset of engineering because you're always working with material. There's always a medium, basically. You're always trying to build something, but the extra challenge on top of engineering is not whether you built it to spec, but it's that you gave the impression you were trying to give. So it's about user experience in software, where it's about giving the experiencer a certain impression. It could be basically anything, but you get there by experimenting with the different results. You'll practice. Basically, you'll practice the art, you'll create prototypes, and you'll judge in the art realm. You'll judge based on whether it gave you the impression you were looking for. And when it does that, generally you can move on to the next piece. But what's interesting about that is that we've come full circle to the impression again.
Yeah.
So it's like the snake eating its own tail thing. Where...
Well, but you've gone from your impression to other people's impression. You have gone from...
No, I mean, look at just yourself. Look at just yourself. Now, take the impression that you have of your background knowledge and put that into the constraint cycle. And then on the other end, you have an impression that you wanted to give yourself. Maybe in the hopes that other people would have the same impression, but not necessarily. It's possible you might be playing with their own subjective situation as an artist.
Yeah.
If you get really abstract, you might just be playing with how many different impressions you can get.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
But what's interesting about that is it does come full circle in that the impressions you give others can go into their constraint cycle. And then they can push it through, and basically it starts as an idea, and they might look at your art and be really inspired.
Right.
And just take it and run with it. And that's kind of what we want. We want the constraint cycle to deliver something shareable. So at each stage in the game,
so here's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is art, is the constraint cycle enterable as a system at, say, a singular stage? So, for instance, is this cycle, can you go into it and you can start at the scientific stage without any impression? Can you start at the engineering stage without any scientific or impression parts?
So you're saying skip over some sections?
Can you skip over the sections?
Yeah. Well, it's all optional. You can
use
this however you see fit.
I don't know if that's true. I think that...
No, it's a matter of personal choice that you use this constraint cycle or not, and each step in it. What happens if you don't do it as prescribed, there are consequences that you can't avoid.
Well, no, I think I think ultimately everyone goes through, even for any artistic thing, has to go through what they want to create or what they feel they should create, the ethic. They have to experiment and see what works, right? And they have to have an intuition of the way they want to generally go. So
you're kind of talking about dependencies.
Yeah.
A little bit. In order to produce this piece of art, you have to start getting used to painting or whatever those parts are.
I'm saying that therefore, whether you practice it or not, whether you actually look at the constraint cycle or not, you are going to go through those steps to achieve any of the things that you want to achieve.
Well,
and that's my positing.
That's not always true.
I'm positing.
That's not always true. I think it could be often true. I think you're kind of forced into it. I think just because the situation will guide you to doing this, because they are dependencies, and you'll recognize that.
Right.
But I think it is possible for you to just jam it through without actually pushing it through the stages.
I'm not saying...
Here's an example.
No,
Can I give an example?
I'm saying the stages are an abstraction of what we inherently do.
Mm-hmm.
So...
What do you mean by that?
So, the constraint cycle is a abstraction of what we already do when we go through, when we want to do an artistic or a sort of thing.
Okay, I see what you're saying. It kind of we're just describing what we do in practice.
Right. And this is what everyone does in practice. They already do this. They're just not mindful that they are doing this.
Yeah, but I think that what I'm trying to say, maybe adding on to that, is that it's possible to misuse it, to misuse the process, and there will be consequences. And I think it would be informative to go over an example.
Yeah.
So if you... Let's say you're a scientist, and you are so dedicated to your career as a scientist you have really only the interest in focusing on science itself, in the very strictest sense of it. You don't care about philosophy. You don't care about engineering. You don't care about, I'll say, ethics. Anything else. Art. You're just trying to go through the formal process of experiment and describing your results, right?
Yeah.
Publishing your papers and all that. So let's say you're doing that. And what happens is you're forced to, whether you like it or not, accept the philosophy. And that actually underlies your personal view of science as well. So science is itself a subset or a kind of philosophy. We'll say that.
Yeah.
So what you did by jumping over the philosophy part is you've just taken on a philosophy without examining it.
Yes. Yes.
And the danger there is that you're missing some layers of constraint, especially logical ones, explanatory ones, that would have helped you in your career as a scientist that you're missing out on. So this is where you get positivism or other philosophies like that, which could be another discussion.
Yeah.
But this actually does happen. But it goes in the other direction on the constraint cycle. Let's say you've ignored the engineering and ethical side of it. Well, then you run into the whole problem of like running unethical experiments, especially in biological field or wherever else.
And this can apply even to like art in, say, the Metropolitan, what is it, MOA, right? The Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, so that's what it is. And just like trash sculptures, right? That's art that's not applying any engineering to it. They have taken trash and they've said, well, what I should do with this, without even thinking about it. Even though they are doing engineering, they are constructing the thing, they're not asking themselves, is this a good thing for me to do? Is this the right way to go about it? And then it doesn't take in aesthetics too, so you get even doubly, crazy.
Yeah,
it's more like science applied to art. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to work over the logic of it. I mean, one other thing that would be a bad consequence of skipping around is that it's relatively cheap to work in the philosophical / conceptual / explanatory realm.
Yeah.
Compared to actually working with experiment and real objects and actually building something. It's cheap. You can work with just ideas. So it helps in terms of efficiency to rule out an idea early in that area.
Yep. Before you
go on. So if you can spot logical conflicts before you get on and get in there and build it and then realize your bridge fell apart.
Yep.
That's an expensive mistake, right? You'd rather not get there. So that's why it's a series, a linear sequence. And you start with the first one, you go to the next one. Yep. You should. You're going to want to.
Yeah.
Right? So, and that leads me to constraint itself. So you're applying constraint to ideas, and you want to actually pin them down. You don't want them to move around. You actually would rather them model reality or what the situation is as closely as possible, or at least give you an approximation that's workable. So when you do that,
what you mean by that when you say you don't want them to wiggle around, you mean that when you apply a constraint, you want it to be next to impossible that it could be anything but the one thing you're looking at, right? That's like pinning something down means there's no way that you can think of that this could be any other way. That's constrained.
Well, if you were to change any part of it, it would break its ability to explain.
Yeah.
And that's actually the sign of a good explanation as described by David Deutsch, where he calls it being hard to vary. It just means that your explanation is really just constrained really well by all kinds of other ideas and explanations and experience and all kinds of things. Maybe even it has some sort of mathematical elegance to it, like the constraint cycle here turns back on itself. I didn't really expect that, but that's just sort of what it did when I was working it out. So another interesting elegance to it is that there's basically four fields of philosophy. There's epistemology, there's metaphysics, there's ethics, and there's aesthetics. And these four, accidentally, again, I didn't intend this, but they actually map to the four segments of the constraint cycle. Before this, I didn't really give too much credence to that particular classification. I just thought that's just what they did. Didn't think about it too much.
The four,
and I figured there could be other classes as well.
The four after intuition, you mean? Because there's 5, isn't there?
Intuition is not a segment of the gauntlet.
Okay.
I would not describe it as it's basically the glue between the piece of it's like it's the process by which you actually I think that's consciousness, what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't call that as a part of the cycle. Because I think consciousness is yielding you impressions. So, and I don't know, maybe consciousness is a 5th segment, and we'll have to think about that. Consciousness is relatively new area for me, but I think we should have a conversation about it at some point. Have another video about it, but there's more that we want to talk about discernment. Just at least one more thing, at least on my side. And that is the idea of truth seeking. So truth seeking is kind of a tricky bag to get into, because truth is ultimately what we want. Generally, it's reality. That reality is what is true, and there's an objective reality and all of that. That's called realism, by the way. But so if you're a realist, you think that there's some kind of truth out there. For us, the epistemologers, that truth is attainable. We can get that roughly modeled in our heads, and there is a process, a very clear process for doing that, and we think we can explain it. So here we set out to do that. But we do it through this constraint cycle and this explanatory thing first. Trying to look for good explanations first isn't the same thing as trying to find truth. It's a different aim. But what happens is if you find that if you do search for good explanations come out of that. It's as a side effect. And you understand why it's true, which is the key thing. The truth itself is not self-explanatory, ever. And the reality is, even if the truth hit you right in the face, and this is a thing with this whole Great Awakening thing, right? But if the truth hit you right in the face, or let's say God himself is whispering in your ear, there's absolutely no way for you to know, at least in feeling of confidence, that is for sure the truth. Same thing for any of the intuitions that you have that pop into your head, or any other guess that you have, or anything like that. So trying to aim for truth is often leading you down the path of trying to feel confident. And that is a very different path than what this constraint cycle leads you down. The constraint cycle is really a path of ruling out ideas and trying to figure out where you're wrong. And it is a very common mistake to, instead of doing that, you go down the other path, which is trying to validate, trying to confirm that you're correct, right?
Yep.
Very different, and it's actually very bad. It prevents access to the truth.
Yeah.
So
because when you try to validate something, you're going to focus. The human beings have a problem. Our brains well, we want to seek out the things, we want to feel confident, so we seek out the things that make us feel confident, which ends in this vicious cycle of us only finding the things that support our views and ignoring any of the other things.
It leads to confirmation bias. It leads to foundationalism, where we put ideas in our back pocket and never revisit them again.
It's not even in our back pocket. They just become part of who we are.
Become part of you, like your identity, where you're like totally transfixed by this idea that if it might have taken you a lifetime getting there, so all your resources went into this one view, and if someone comes in with an obvious, explicit description of why it's wrong, you might react pretty
violently, like badly.
Yeah, in defense.
Yeah.
Because they're attacking a part of you, right?
Yep.
But this is bad. We don't want to go down this path. So this is why it's much better philosophy to treat all this information as guesswork and as being potentially wrong, which is called fallibilism. So you want to treat these ideas as being wrong, probably in some way.
And you just don't know yet.
Eventually you'll figure it out.
Yep.
How it's wrong, and be prepared to revisit anything that you've passed over before. Even if you've seen it as true before, you might have been wrong.
Or
even if you've judged it as being false, you might have been wrong.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So everything is could be up in the air. Like you might be in a state of be on your toes, right? You want to be flexible with your ideas. So just keep shoving it through that constraint cycle over, and that's really the only thing. The logic of it is very simple. You're just looking for conflicts between ideas. So the last thing with the truth seeking, I know this is a lot to absorb, but I wanted to talk about tricks, deceit, and lying. Because truth seekers will be very frustrated by how much disinfo and lying is flying around, especially now because the political area is so messy right now. But us as epistemologers and anyone that follows along with our line of thinking will see that as sort of
lies are an extension of
the air we're all breathing, basically. You're able to jump into a muddy pool and it will just come off of you, because all of this information is potentially false or lie or disinfo or misinfo. So you're prepared to accept that.
Yeah.
And it will never change. People who think they're telling you the truth might be wrong.
Right.
Right? So there's never getting away with this reality of having all of this misinfo. And it might only get worse from here on out. The more complex society gets, and the more we know, and the bigger our population gets, the more noise there is.
Yep.
So it might get really bad. Really, really bad. In those terms, it would be really bad for a foundationalist. But for a fallibilist, realize that a good explanation is a kind of a trick. Yes. Right? It tricks you into understanding the world better than you used to. That's the key. So you want to be tricked in that way because it leaves you in a more empowered state. The more constrained your ideas, the more they model reality, or the closer they model reality, the more empowered you are. So the more freedom you have, basically.
Right. So
you want to be tricked in this way, and consider this analogy. Telescopes are often electric. They're hooked up to a computer screen where you're looking at pixels of the stars or whatever else, like a nebula or something.
Yep. Basically,
those are just pixels. You're looking at pixels. But you want those pixels to be configured in a way that tricks your eye, tricks you, your mind, into thinking you're seeing stars or a nebula or whatever else, right? You want it to trick you in a particular way.
Yeah.
That leaves you with a better understanding of the way things are. That's the key. And this is true about any kind of information because it only comes to you through layers and layers of basically tricks. Layers and layers of encoding and decoding and encoding and decoding. As it goes through the internet, like over the internet and into your computer and out into the display and all of this is just encoding into different formats out into the light, into the room, into your eyes. Even your brain is encoding and decoding electrical signals in order to make sense of the visual field. It's all just layers and layers of interpretation, and in each layer is the possibility of being wrong, which is how optical illusions exist.
Right.
Because your eye is making assumptions about how
something
light works and how objects, how shadows fall and how perspective works, and those assumptions can be gamed.
Yep.
It will never go away. So truth seekers get frustrated. Just don't worry about that. Just try to explain what you're seeing. That's it. You won't get frustrated. Everything will just, all this misinfo and whatever, just bounces off of you.
Well, I think that about wraps up our discussion.
Long-winded discussion.
Yeah.
A lot of points to get, but that's the discernment is very complex, and it frustrated me that no one was unpacking it. They're just like, yeah, just decide what you want. Just feel it out. And no, there's an actual process that helps. And here it is.
So please leave your comments, explanations, your half-formed explanations, and your
like and subscribe,
and your subscribes, and we'll
see you next time.
See you next time.